On September 13, 1918, inside a house at 83 Beals Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy went into labor with her third child. The attending physician wasn't there. Whether stuck in traffic or overwhelmed by the Spanish influenza pandemic tearing through Boston that fall, he hadn't arrived, and a nurse, following what she believed to be proper protocol, physically held Rose's legs together to prevent delivery until the doctor could make it. The baby's head was already visible in the birth canal. 2 hours. That's how long the infant was held in place, her brain slowly starving of oxygen, while everyone in that room waited for a man who wasn't coming fast enough. When the doctor finally arrived and the girl was delivered, she appeared healthy. They named her Rosemary. But 2 hours of oxygen deprivation had already caused permanent brain damage, and the consequences would follow her for the rest of her life. 23 years later, her father would come up with his own solution to the damage that nurse caused. His solution was worse than anything that happened in that delivery room. Joe Kennedy's ruthlessness didn't just build a political machine, it destroyed his most vulnerable child. Every tragedy that followed the Kennedy name looks less like a curse and more like a receipt. To understand what was taken from Rosemary Kennedy in November of 1941, you first have to know what she had. She kept a diary, wrote letters in her own handwriting, attended dances and family gatherings alongside 8 siblings who moved through the world faster than she did, but never, at least in those early years, without her. In 1938, at 19 years old, Rosemary was presented at the court of King George VI in London, wearing a picture dress of white tulle embroidered with silver paillettes, standing beside her mother and sister Kathleen in the receiving line. Photographs from the event show a beautiful young woman, poised and smiling, indistinguishable from any other debutante in the receiving line. Her IQ fell in the range of mild to moderate intellectual disability. She was slower than her siblings to read, slower to write, slower to master the social precision the Kennedy children were expected to deploy with effortless grace. But slower didn't mean incapable. Rosemary could record her thoughts on paper. She could navigate a formal court presentation before the British royal family at 19 without incident. People who knew her described warmth and sociability, a young woman with feelings, experiences, and a life she was living on her own terms. She was a person. Her father saw a problem. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. had spent his adult life accumulating power and eliminating anything that threatened it. His first fortune came through stock manipulation and widely alleged bootlegging during Prohibition, methods that established early and permanently that rules applied to other people. That money went into a Hollywood studio, where he conducted a flagrant affair with actress Gloria Swanson, while Rose raised their growing family at home. In 1937, he secured an appointment as United States ambassador to the Court of St. James's, the most prestigious diplomatic post in the American Foreign Service, an Irish Catholic from Boston installed at the summit of Anglo-American relations. And then, he demolished it. Open sympathy toward Nazi Germany, defeatist insistence that Britain couldn't survive Hitler, barely concealed anti-Semitism. By 1940, Joe's ambassadorship was finished, his political career was over, and the dreams he'd harbored of his own presidency were permanently dead. None of this slowed him down. It redirected him. Joe transferred the entire crushing weight of his thwarted ambitions onto his children. Joe Jr., the eldest son, was being groomed for the White House. Jack was the backup. The girls were expected to marry well and reinforce the family's position. In this household, individual desires were secondary to family ambition. Every child was expected to compete, to win, to project an image of vigor and excellence that served the collective project their father was engineering. There was no room in this architecture for weakness, No tolerance for anyone who might disrupt the image. A child who couldn't succeed threatened everything Joe was building. Rosemary couldn't keep up, and by 1940, when she was 22, she was doing something Joe found even more dangerous than falling behind. She was becoming uncontrollable. The nuns at her Washington, D.C. convent school reported violent mood swings and rages. She was sneaking out at night. Whether this was ordinary youthful rebellion amplified by the frustration of being constantly measured against overachieving siblings, or some neurological change that historians can't fully account for, the practical result was the same. The nuns were terrified she might become pregnant, contract a sexually transmitted disease, or create exactly the kind of public scandal that Joe Kennedy had spent his lifetime engineering against. For a family whose future depended on projecting Catholic respectability and aristocratic poise, a daughter sneaking out of a convent represented an existential threat, not to Rosemary herself, but to the image. Joe Kennedy had demonstrated across every arena of his life that when something endangered his interests, he eliminated it. His daughter was now something that endangered his interests. The man Joe found to solve this problem was Dr. Walter Jackson Freeman, a neurologist and psychiatrist who had reinvented himself as the nation's loudest champion of a procedure called the prefrontal lobotomy. Freeman, alongside neurosurgeon Dr. James W. Watts, had been performing lobotomies since 1936, and by 1941 had refined a single compelling pitch. The lobotomy could calm the agitated, quiet the disruptive, render the unmanageable docile. During the 1940s, approximately 5,000 lobotomies were performed annually in the United States, the vast majority on young women whose behavioral problems ranged from genuine psychosis to garden-variety defiance of social expectations. Freeman would go on to perform nearly 3,000 procedures over his career, eventually pioneering a technique that involved inserting an instrument resembling an ice pick through the eye socket and into the brain, a procedure so crude that he sometimes performed it in his office without proper anesthesia. Freeman assured Joe that a lobotomy was the best option available for Rosemary. Joe said yes. In 1941, lobotomy wasn't a fringe procedure. Freeman was affiliated with George Washington University and had published extensively in medical journals. Egas Moniz would receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1949 for developing the leucotomy, the procedure from which the lobotomy descended, a fact that shows how deeply psychosurgery had embedded itself in mainstream medicine by mid-century. All of this is true. What is also true, many physicians considered Freeman reckless and his claims extravagant even then. Catastrophic outcomes were well documented in the literature of the day. Joe Kennedy wasn't a desperate father following the unanimous counsel of his daughter's doctors. He sought out a radical procedure from a controversial figure to address a social problem, not a medical one. Rosemary's mood swings and nighttime escapes required patience, accommodation, and the kind of sustained support that the Kennedy family, with virtually unlimited wealth, could easily have provided. The lobotomy wasn't the only option. It was a choice, Joe's choice, and he made it alone. In November of 1941, 23-year-old Rosemary Kennedy was brought to a surgical suite, mildly sedated but awake. Freeman and Watts instructed her to recite the Lord's Prayer, then to sing, "God Bless America," then to count backward. They needed her awake because they were using her voice as a gauge, monitoring the gradual disintegration of her ability to form words and hold thoughts as they used an instrument resembling a butter knife to sever the white matter connections in her frontal lobes. Rosemary recited. She sang. Her voice began to slur. The words lost coherence. The melody broke apart. And then she went silent. They had cut until there was nothing left. Joe Kennedy had authorized the procedure without telling his wife. He didn't inform Rose until after it was finished. The young woman who came out of that surgical suite bore no resemblance to the one who had entered it. Rosemary's mental capacity had been reduced to that of a 2-year-old. She could barely walk, barely speak. She was incontinent. The diary entries, the court presentation, the dances, the handwritten letters, the nighttime escapes that had so alarmed the nuns, all of it was gone. In its place was someone who would require round-the-clock institutional care for the remaining 64 years of her life. Joe's response was purely logistical. Rosemary was removed from the family's orbit and eventually transferred to St. Coletta, a facility for the intellectually disabled run by Catholic nuns in Jefferson, Wisconsin, roughly as far from the Kennedy compounds in Hyannisport and Palm Beach as you could get while remaining in the continental United States. Then came the gag order. Rosemary wasn't to be discussed. Her name wasn't to be mentioned. Her existence was to be erased from the family story as completely as if she had never been born. 8 siblings were told their sister was away. No address, no phone number, no way to contact her. The family that built its mythology on fierce bonds of loyalty, on competitive devotion, on an us-against-the-world cohesion that biographers would romanticize for generations, that family absorbed the absence of one of its members, like a tree growing around a fence post, until the outline became invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. For the outside world, cover stories rotated as needed. Rosemary was reclusive. When the family eventually acknowledged that she was mentally retarded, a term that in mid-century America carried crushing stigma, but was infinitely preferable to the truth, the framing always implied something congenital, something she'd been born with, never something done to her on a surgical table while she sang. Jack Kennedy won his congressional seat in 1946, his Senate seat in 1952, the presidency in 1960. Campaign photographs never included Rosemary. She never showed up at the compound for holidays. An entire decade of the most scrutinized political rise in American history unfolded as though the third Kennedy child simply didn't exist. The truth didn't reach the American public until 1987. 46 years of silence. 46 years during which a living woman sat in a Wisconsin facility, unable to form complete sentences, while her family's official position was that she was simply quiet. Joe Kennedy never visited Rosemary at St. Coletta. Not once. The man who made the decision, who contacted Freeman, who authorized the cutting, he walked away and never looked back. And Rose? Rose Kennedy appeared on the Phil Donahue Show and told a national television audience that she didn't know about the lobotomy. She delivered this claim with the composed certainty of a woman who had spent her entire adult life before cameras, who understood that conviction was more persuasive than truth. She looked into the lens and said she hadn't known. Kennedy biographers and historical researchers assembled a very different record. Multiple accounts based on primary sources indicate Rose wasn't merely informed about the procedure. She was present. Place what Rose said on that Donahue stage beside the documented findings of scholars who spent years reconstructing the events of November 1941, and you find a conflict that can't be reconciled. At minimum, she knew about the lobotomy before it was performed. At maximum, she was in the room while her daughter's voice dissolved into silence. Her behavior in the decades that followed doesn't support the version she sold on television. Rose Kennedy didn't visit Rosemary at St. Coletta for 20 years. 2 full decades without seeing her daughter. A mother who genuinely hadn't known what was done to her child would have torn the family apart looking for answers, would have demanded explanations, would have raged against the husband who made the decision in secret. Rose did none of this. She continued raising her other children, attended fundraisers and campaign events, smiled in photographs, went to Mass, stayed away from Jefferson, Wisconsin for 2 decades, which is the behavior of someone who knew precisely what had happened and couldn't bring herself to face the result. Eunice Kennedy Shriver was the exception. In 1962, Eunice wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post, the first time any member of the family publicly acknowledged Rosemary's intellectual disability. Even then, the lobotomy itself went unmentioned. But Eunice began visiting Rosemary at St. Coletta, and in 1968, she founded the Special Olympics, an organization driven explicitly by what had been done to her sister. Whatever combination of guilt and love Eunice carried through her life, she converted it into something real, something that outlasted the damage. One genuinely redemptive act born from the wreckage her father had created. Back in 1958, Eunice had made a statement about Rosemary that contains an almost unbearable choice of words. The solution of Rosemary's problem has been a major factor in the ability of all the Kennedys to go about their life's work. She didn't call Rosemary's disability the factor. She called the solution the factor. Eunice understood what required atonement. She always did. Eunice founded the Special Olympics in the same year Bobby was assassinated. By 1968, the family had been absorbing catastrophe for more than 2 decades, a sequence of disasters that people had taken to calling the Kennedy curse, as though the tragedies were supernatural, inexplicable, the work of some malevolent force that had singled out one American family for special punishment. The timeline tells a more specific story. On August 12, 1944, Joe Kennedy Jr., the eldest son, the one groomed for the presidency, the vessel carrying every ounce of his father's redirected ambition, was killed when his plane exploded over the English Channel during Operation Aphrodite. He was 29. In 1948, Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy died in a plane crash over France. She was 28. On December 19, 1961, Joe Kennedy Sr. suffered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed and unable to speak. That same year, the remaining Kennedy children finally learned where their sister Rosemary had been hidden for the past 20 years. And now, the man who had authorized the severing of his daughter's brain until she went silent was himself locked inside a body that couldn't produce words. He would spend the next 8 years in that condition, conscious, aware, mute. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. His father watched it happen on a television screen. He couldn't speak. On June 5, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Los Angeles. His father was still alive, still watching, still unable to form a single word. Ted Kennedy drove a car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. Mary Jo Kopechne drowned. Joe Kennedy Sr. died on November 18, 1969, having spent his final 8 years mute and immobile, while his sons were destroyed on screens in front of him, screens he couldn't turn away from and couldn't respond to. The name kept collecting grief after he was gone. David Kennedy, Robert's son, died of a drug overdose in a Palm Beach hotel room in 1984. Michael Kennedy, another of Robert's sons, was killed in a skiing accident in Aspen in 1997. John F. Kennedy Jr., the little boy who had saluted his father's coffin, was killed on July 16, 1999, when the small plane he was piloting crashed into the Atlantic off Martha's Vineyard. People kept calling it a curse. The word does useful work for the Kennedy legacy. It assigns responsibility to something external, to fate, to God, to the unknowable. It frames the family as victims of forces beyond human control. It asks for sympathy instead of scrutiny. Rosemary Kennedy outlived her father, outlived Jack, outlived Bobby, outlived nearly every Kennedy man whose death fed the mythology of undeserved suffering. She died on January 7, 2005, at 86 years old, at St. Coletta, the facility where she had lived for 56 years. She was 23 when they took her voice. Her father lost his at 73. He got 8 years of silence. She got 64. If you found this story worth hearing, subscribe for more.